Hi everybody, Steve Matthews here. Thanks for joining me today for episode 8 of our walk through Dr. John Robin's book, Ecclesiastical Megalomania, the Economics and Political Thought of the Roman Catholic Church. I know it's been a little while since I've made a video. I guess it's been, I want to say 4 or 5 months, which is 4 or 5 months too long. I know that. I had a friend send me a tweet a couple weeks back, and he's, Steve, are you ever going to make another Ecclesiastical Megalomania video? And I said, well, I'm working on it. And I wasn't kidding. That was the truth. I was working on it at the time. And anyway, I think I'm finally at a point where I can start making some videos again. That's one of the occupational hazards of having a full-time job, I suppose, is you sometimes get pulled away and have to do things maybe you don't always want to do, but you need to do. So it looks like things are a little bit better here for me going forward. So I think there's going to be some opportunities to be a little bit more consistent on the video front. So today we're going to be talking, as I said, this is episode number 8 in our walk through Ecclesiastical Megalomania. And today we're going to be taking a look at chapter 3. Now, the title of chapter 3 of Ecclesiastical Megalomania is Rerum Novarum, on the condition of the working classes. Let me read through the first paragraph here of this chapter, and we'll unpack that a little bit and talk about it. So here we go. Quote, one of the Roman Church State's most influential statements on economic matters is the 1891 encyclical Rerum Novarum, on the condition of the working classes. In this encyclical, the Roman Church State allied herself with the proletariat, which in Marxism is the great and final enemy of the capitalist order. In encyclicals, Marxism is so blatant that one Roman Catholic writer declared that, inner quote, much of the encyclical, Rerum Novarum, appeared only to repeat in more orthodox language what Marx had said 10 years earlier, end inner quote. Marx's Das Kapital had been published in 1881, end quote. And that's from page 43. That's the first paragraph of chapter 3. So, there are a number of things here in this chapter, so let's go back and talk a little bit about that. So, one of the things we learn, of course, right away is that Rerum Novarum is an encyclical letter written by Pope Leo XIII in 1891. So 129 years ago. Now, you may be asking yourself, of course, especially if you're not a Roman Catholic, you may be asking, so just what is an encyclical letter? What's an encyclical? What does that mean? Well, according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, an encyclical letter is a letter written by the Pope for the whole Roman Catholic Church on matters of doctrine, morals, or discipline. So encyclical letters, just by that definition, are obviously pretty important documents in the Roman Catholic Church. They're written by the Pope, so he's the head of the Roman Catholic Church, so number one. So anything that's written or said by the Pope is, by that very nature, going to be pretty important. And these are letters that are addressed to the whole church. So it's not just addressed to maybe some special segment of the church, but it's addressed to the entire Roman Catholic Church. So it has a very wide audience as well. And of course, if you watch the news at all, you may be aware that when popes release encyclicals, there's usually a lot of coverage even in the press. And in fact, the current Pope, Pope Francis I, he issued an encyclical, I think it's been about 2 weeks now. It's called Fratelli Tutti. And I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I'd like to, at least to get a sense of what he's saying. But yeah, it got a lot of coverage even in the secular press, even in places like the New York Times or the Washington Post or some of the major maybe TV networks or websites will cover papal encyclicals, even if they're not necessarily specifically Roman Catholic stations or religious stations. They still cover them because it's a big deal. So encyclical letters are a big deal. That's one thing we can definitely say about them. A few other things regarding Rerum Novarum specifically. That title, it's a Latin title, and it means new things if you translate that into English. Now, encyclical letters, by their nature, as I said, are pretty important documents, but I think some you could probably argue are maybe more foundational, more important than others. And certainly Rerum Novarum, I think, would have to rank as one of the most important encyclical letters that's ever been written. Let's see what a few Roman Catholic sources have to say about Rerum Novarum itself. Now, this is from the Catholic Encyclopedia. The Catholic Encyclopedia says, quote, probably no other pronouncement on the social question has had so many readers or exercised such a wide influence, end quote. So that's Pretty high praise coming from Catholic Encyclopedia, at least regarding the importance of this encyclical. There's a book that was published a few years ago, about 15, maybe 16 years ago, called The Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church. And in that book, we read this, quote, starting with Rerum Novarum, the Church has never stopped considering the problems of workers within the context of a social question, which has progressively taken on worldwide dimensions, end quote. So that's the compendium of the social doctrine of the Church, what it has to say about Rerum Novarum. And finally, here's a quote from the website of an archdiocese. It's the Archdiocese of Gatineau. I found this just out there on the web, and I think they have a pretty interesting statement here. The Archdiocese of Gatineau, that is it's in Canada. It's a Canadian archdiocese, Roman Catholic archdiocese. Here's what they said. Quote, Pope Leo XIII was the first to publish an encyclical on social issues, condemning the horrible conditions certain employers were imposing on their workers. In the name of the gospel, he invited governments to implement labor laws and safeguards that would encompass fairer and more equitable work practices. This encyclical, called Rerum Novarum, New Things, marked the beginning of what in the Church we would today call his social doctrine. That was in 1891. So, since 1891, there's been this whole body of literature that's been built up within the Roman Catholic Church. They call it the social doctrine of the Roman Catholic Church. Sometimes I've seen it described as the social teaching of the Roman Catholic Church. To give you maybe another sense of the importance of Rerum Novarum, here's a book that was published by Rome back in 1991 called Proclaiming Justice and Peace. And notice the subtitle here. It says, Papal Documents from Rerum Novarum through Centesimus Annus. Now, there's a reason it starts with Rerum Novarum. It's because that encyclical is foundational. It really was the beginning, kind of like what that quote there from the Archdiocese of Gatineau said. It talked about, beginning with Rerum Novarum. It said it marked the beginning of what the Church, what in the Church we would call his social doctrine. So according to that Archdiocese, Rerum Novarum was the beginning of the Roman Catholic Church's social doctrine. You can see it again here in this book. Papal documents from Rerum Novarum to Centesimus Annus. Centesimus Annus is the name of another encyclical that was written by Pope John Paul II in 1991. Centesimus Annus means 100th year, and that encyclical was written to celebrate the 100th anniversary of Rerum Novarum. And there are several other papal encyclicals that are specifically like that. They're written on key anniversaries of Rerum Novarum, and they look back and they talk about that particular encyclical. So again, that's some additional proof that the Rerum Novarum is a pretty important document. And I was talking about, the body of Roman Catholic social teaching or social doctrine, how it's been built up since 1891. Now you can see this is a pretty thick book right here. And that book's from 1991. I suppose if that's 29 years ago. So if you issued something like this, a similar book today, it'd probably be a good deal thicker even than what it was at that time. Maybe about 30% thicker, I'd judge, or maybe 29%. I don't know. But it would definitely be bigger because, of course, the Rome has continued to develop its social teaching. All right, so there's a few things about we can glean from the first paragraph. Oh, one other thing, and I think this is pretty important. Note that one of the things that John Robbins talked about is the fact that the encyclical was critical of capitalism, and to make its critique of capitalism, it borrowed a lot from Marxist language. Now, when that encyclical was first published in 1891, Marx's book Das Kapital had only been published 10 years earlier in 1881. So Marx's thought was still pretty fresh, was still pretty new in people's minds, and the Church seized upon this, which is kind of interesting because, of course, Marx claims to have supported the proletariat, the working class. That's one of the things that John Robbins mentioned there in that first paragraph. Marxism historically has identified itself with the working class, but historically, if you go back and you look at the Roman Catholic Church, Rome has identified itself with the aristocracy. But here in 1891, they made a break. They changed their allegiance from the aristocracy, or at least changed the emphasis. I won't say that they didn't have allegiance to the aristocracy, but they took the church in a new direction. to try to identify with the working classes. Here's what John Robbins says about some of this. He says, quote, "For centuries, the Roman church state have resisted the advance of the Reformation and its economic system, capitalism. In opposing capitalism, it had allied itself with the medieval aristocracy. Now when that aristocracy was disappearing, a new ally had to be found." So that's what John Robbins said. And he goes on, he quotes some other writers, and I'll just mention this briefly. That new ally that Rome was seeking, they sought it in, quote, popular instead of princely support, according to one Catholic writer that John Robbins quoted there. So again, that was a pretty major break with Rerum Novarum, that they were going after that popular vote, so to speak, as opposed to trying to appeal to the aristocracy. Now there are some big ideas in this chapter. I'm not going to cover everything. This is actually a chapter that's jam-packed with some great information. But one of and what I'm going to focus on here is 3 economic systems that John Robbins discusses. He talks about capitalism, he talks about communism, and he talks about fascism. So let's take a look at a few things here. Now you may recall from a few videos back that John Robbins talked about, he used the term constitutional capitalism to describe the political and economic system of the Bible. So in constitutional capitalism, you have limited government and you have free markets. That's what capitalism is, free markets. And we'll define it a little more carefully in a bit here, but that's what the Bible teaches. Now, Rome believes in a system of politics and economics in which the government interferes in the workings of the free market. Rome does not favor free markets. That's been one of the major themes. We've talked about this in several videos now. That keeps coming back as you study Rome. Rome opposes capitalism. Rome opposes limited government. And John Robbins quotes a later encyclical by a pope. This is Pope Pius XI, who wrote, quote, "In fact, the encyclical Rerum Novarum completely overthrew those tottering tenets of liberalism, which had long hampered effective interference by government," end quote. So the Pope, this Pope Pius Pope Pius XI, and other popes as well, including the current Pope, Pope Francis, they all favor interference by the government in the economy. That's what they push. That's what Rome has always pushed. Now, one thing to clear up here, you might notice in that quote that I just read you from Pius XI, he talked about the tottering tenets of liberalism, which have long hampered effective interference by government. Pius the 11th there is using the term liberalism in a different way probably than what you're thinking. Now, for most of us here living in 2020, when we hear the word liberalism, we tend to think socialism. We tend to think big government, liberal socialism. Well, liberalism actually meant the exact opposite back in the day. Back in the 19th century especially, if you were a liberal in the 19th century, you believed in limited government and free markets. It's kind of funny how in 150 years or so that whole definition is completely flipped 180 degrees. Just as proof of that, I have a friend of mine in Australia, and he told me that there are 2 major parties in Australia, just like in the United States. In the United States, we have the Republicans that are considered to be the sort of the free market party. They're usually called conservatives now, and we have the Democrats, who are usually identified with socialism. Well, in Australia, they have the Liberal Party and they have the Labour Party. Now, the Labour Party in Australia, they're the socialists, they're the equivalent of the Democrats in Australia. But the Liberal Party, interestingly enough, is the equivalent of the Republicans, of the conservatives in the United States. They supposedly stand for free markets, limited government, those types of things. But yet they're called the Liberal Party. And that term liberal is actually an older usage of that term. And if you read writers from the 18th century, or the 19th century rather, you'll see them use that term liberalism in that sense to mean free markets, limited government. And this Pope Pius the 11th, was opposed to that type of liberalism. He wanted the government to interfere. And now we call government interference liberalism. So it's, like I say, it's interesting how those ideas flipped. Now, in this particular chapter, as I said, John Robbins talks about 3 types of economic systems. He talks about capitalism, communism, and fascism. And he gives us some really good definitions. Now, let's take a look here at the first one, capitalism. Now, I'll read this quote from you. This is coming right from John Robbins' quote. Capitalism, which is sometimes called the free enterprise system, the private property order, or laissez faire, is the economic system in which individuals and groups are free to own property of all sorts and to dispose of it as they see fit. It is the economic counterpart of the political system of limited government, in which the only functions of government are the punishment of evildoers, that is, criminals, and praise of the good. And Robbins also quotes a German sociologist by the name of Max Weber, who wrote back in the early part of the 20th century. Max Weber wrote this, quote, "Capitalism was the social counterpart of Calvinist theology," end quote. And that's pretty interesting. A lot of people don't really think of Calvinism or think of the Bible as having an economic system. But this sociologist, Max Weber, he understood that capitalism and Calvinism, they go together. Now, I'm not saying necessarily that everybody who's a Calvinist necessarily understands that, but they do. Those are two things that go together. And if we say on the one hand that we're Christians, that we believe in sovereign grace, and Calvinism is just a nickname for the doctrines of grace. If we say we believe in those things, but yet we adopt socialism, our economics isn't lining up with our theology. It's important as Christians that we have our economics and our theology aligned. We want to be logical. We want to think logically. We want to think systematically. And those two things, Calvinism, the doctrines of grace, and capitalism, they go together. So let's look at a few other things about capitalism. One of the things, and I want you to, this is a big takeaway, and I want you to get this from John Robbins' definition. I'm going to go back and reread this here. He says that he describes capitalism as the economic system in which individuals and groups are free to own property, number one, and to dispose of it as they see fit. So this is the key to capitalism. You're allowed to own all sorts of property, and you're allowed to use it as you see fit. Now, both of these doctrines can be found in the Bible. Let's take, for instance, the first one of those, the ability to own property, to hold the title to property. Now, there are a lot of verses in Scripture that you can bring forth, but we have somewhat limited time here, so I'll just cite one. The 8th commandment, thou shalt not steal. Okay? Now, the implied in that statement, thou shalt not steal, is that there is such a thing as private property. Because the concept of theft depends upon the concept of private property. If there's no such thing as private property, if you're not allowed to own anything, well, you can't steal. So it would be nonsense to even have a commandment prohibiting something that you couldn't do. So private property is implied in that commandment, thou shalt not steal. So, the Bible definitely teaches that we are allowed to own property. Now, the other thing, as I said, there are two main aspects of capitalism. There's the ability to own and also to dispose. Think about in the idea of being able to use your property as you want. You can see that in the parable of the workers in the vineyard. It's found in Matthew 20. Now, you may remember that parable, and that's the parable where there's this vineyard owner, and he goes out early in the morning, and he hires some guys to come work in his vineyard, and he says, "I'll pay you such and such," and they come and they start working, and a few hours later he goes out and he finds some more workers, and he says, "Well, come and work in my vineyard, and I'll pay you so much for your trouble." And then toward the end of the day, he finds another group of men who haven't been hired, and he says, "Come and work in my vineyard, and I'll pay you a certain wage." And at the end of the day, at the end of the workday, he brings all these groups together, these three groups, and he pays them all the same thing. Now, you may remember the workers who started early on, they were upset about this. They thought, "Wow, you're giving these guys that you hired and only worked an hour, you're giving the same amount as I did, and I worked all day." And the vineyard owner rebukes them, and he tells them, and this was the key part of his response. He says, "Is it not lawful for me to do what I wish with my own things?" Is it not lawful for me to do what I wish with my own things? That is, he had the legal right to do what he wanted with his own property. So he had the right to use his property as he saw fit. So he both owned the vineyard, and he also used his money as he saw fit. You could both own things, and you can use those things as you wish. So those are the two keys really in to capitalism. Now, the next economic system he discusses in this chapter is communism. And here's what John Robbins says about communism. This is from page 57. He says, quote, "In communist states, property, that is the means of production, is both legally owned and controlled by the government," end quote. Now, a common misconception that people have about communism is that they think, well, in communism, there's no such thing as private property. Well, that's not really true. In a communist economy, people are still allowed to own personal effects. For instance, if you were living in the Soviet Union back in before the Soviet Union fell. I grew up during the Cold War, so I think about the Soviet Union, of course, when I think of communism. If you lived in the Soviet Union, you were allowed to own your own pair of shoes. You could own a shirt. You could own various other personal effects. You could own your own loaf of bread, for example. But what you couldn't own was you could not own the means of producing those goods. So you couldn't own a shoe factory. You could own your own shoes, but you couldn't own the factory where the shoes were produced, or the store where the shoes were sold. Likewise, you could own your own loaf of bread, but you couldn't own the farm where the wheat was grown, or the bakery where the wheat was turned into bread. So you weren't allowed to own capital goods, the means of production. Now, one of the things that's interesting, despite the fact that the Roman Catholic Church in Rerum Novarum and also in some subsequent publications has used some very Marxist-sounding language, Rome ultimately rejects communism. The economics that Rome teaches is not communist. Although, like I say, they use some Marxist language to critique capitalism, but the economics that they actually teach isn't really communism. What they do teach is the third system of economics that John Robbins addresses in this chapter, and that is fascism. So let's talk a little bit about fascism. So what is fascism? Well, here's what he says, John Robbins says. He says, "Fascism is a form of socialism that retains the forms and titles and trappings of capitalism, but not its substance. Under fascism, property, titles, and deeds are intact, but the institution of private property has disappeared. Government regulations and mandates have replaced it. For this distinction between legal ownership and actual use, the fascists owe a debt to the Roman church state." That's from page 58. So to kind of sum that up, in a fascist economy, you can own a factory, you can own a farm, you can own capital goods, the means of production, but the government controls and regulates everything that you do with it. So even though you have title to a property, maybe say title to a farm, the government interferes constantly in your ability to use that. In capitalism, you may recall there were two things. There was ownership and use. Ownership and use in capitalism, they're like two sides of the same coin, they go together. In fascism, ownership and use are separated. So you can own property, but the government tells you how to use it. And that's the important distinction to make between capitalism and fascism, and also capitalism and communism. In communism, you can't own your own farm. In a fascist state, you can own your own farm, but the government's going to tell you how to use it. In capitalism, you can own your own farm, and you can use it as you see fit. That's the difference between those three systems. But the Roman Catholic Church actually advocates a fascist system of economics. Let me read a couple quotes here to you. This is from pages 57 and 58. This is John Robbins writing, quote, "Leo XIII, perhaps innovating a bit with Thomas," he's talking about Thomas Aquinas, "wrote that to own goods privately is a right natural to man. But he makes the distinction, while property may be privately owned, it must be publicly used. He wrote," and this is Leo XIII speaking here, quote, "To own goods privately, as we saw above, is a right natural to man, and to exercise this right, especially in life, in society, is not only lawful, but also clearly necessary. But if the question be asked, how ought man to use his possessions, the Church replies without hesitation. As to this point, man ought not regard external goods as his own, but as common. So there you go. He separates the idea of ownership and use. And here's John Robbins picks up, quote, Leo XIII's distinction between private legal ownership and common use is the economic and legal theory behind 20th century fascism. In communist states, property, that is the means of production, is both legally owned and controlled by the government. This complete collectivization is condemned by the Roman Church state. But in fascist states, much property is privately owned, while being regulated and controlled by the government for public use and the common good. Under fascism, property owners may keep their property titles and deeds, but the use of their property is, as Leo XIII wrote, common. End quote. Now, I wanted to come back and say a few words about Pope Francis. Now, we talked a bit about the Rerum Novarum and how much of its critique of capitalism used really pretty heavily Marxist language. Now, a lot of people, Roman Catholics, and these are Roman Catholics who maybe are very Americanized in their thinking, and there are a lot of Roman Catholics who are. Roman Catholics who inconsistently accept and advocate for capitalism. It's kind of interesting, even though they're Roman Catholics, they've seen, I think, the benefits of capitalism, and I think they are sincere in believing in capitalism as a proper system of economics, even if that's inconsistent with what their church teaches. But a lot of people, a lot of these more conservative, these more entrepreneurial thinking Roman Catholics are very upset with Pope Francis back in 2013. Francis became Pope in 2013, and not long after he became Pope, he issued I think it was called an apostolic exhortation called Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel. And he was sharply critical of capitalism in that apostolic exhortation. And it really got a lot of Roman Catholics upset. And from that time, even to the present time, a lot of Roman Catholics have considered, well, Pope Francis' teaching, is way outside of the church norm. The church teaches something over here, and the Pope is teaching something that's way over here. But that's not true. That's one of the things you learn when you start going back and looking at some of these church documents, such as Rerum Novarum. The church has employed communist-sounding language almost as long as the communists have been around. I mean, going back at least 130, almost 130 years, since 1891. So when Pope Francis makes Marxist-type statements to critique capitalism, he's well within the traditional teaching of the Roman Catholic Church, well within the social doctrine of the Roman Catholic Church that's been built up since 1891. So he's not doing anything unusual, despite the fact that some Roman Catholics today think that he is. He's actually very much in line with church teaching. Okay, so that about wraps it up. As I said, there's a lot more in this chapter than what I've given you. We just kind of touched on some of the main highlights here. So just to summarize what we're talking about here, just as the Bible has a distinct view of politics and economics, so too does Rome. And these are separate systems. They're not the same systems of thought at all. Rerum Novarum is a landmark encyclical written in 1891 by Pope Leo XIII. In his encyclical, he attacked the biblical ideas of limited government and free enterprise, what John Robbins called constitutional capitalism. The language of Rerum Novarum borrows heavily from Marxist thought. Rerum Novarum, this is point number 2, sort of summary point number 2. Rerum Novarum teaches that the purpose of government is not, as the Bible teaches, to serve as the guardian of law and order. Government, Rome tells us, has an obligation to interfere in the economy to promote the common good. And the third and last summary point I wanted to make here is this. While Rerum Novarum's critique of capitalism borrows heavily from Marxist thought, the Church does not endorse Marxism. Instead, Rome's economics is fascist. Fascism is the economic system, and it's a socialist economic system, in which private ownership of the means of production is allowed, but everything is regulated and controlled by the government. Well, that's all for today. That's all for the chapter 3 on Rerum Novarum. I hope you found that interesting. I think, like I say, there's a tremendous amount in this chapter, and I would really encourage you, not just to rely on the videos that I'm giving you here, because I can't cover everything in these videos, but to actually get a copy of Ecclesiastical Megalomania for yourself. And in the description below, and I'm going to put some things down there, and that's in that description down there right underneath the screen. I'm going to put some things in there. I'm going to have a summary of today's lesson. And there, I'm also going to have a link that'll take you straight to the Trinity Foundation website where you can buy your own copy of Ecclesiastical Megalomania. And if you like, you can follow along with me as I make some of these videos. The book actually, it's not terribly pricey. It's only $9.99 for the paperback. I can't remember what the hardback version is, but it's not that much more. Either one of them are very affordable. So I'd encourage you to buy this book. It's really an extraordinary book. There's nothing else like that out there on the market. While you're on the website, by the way, the Trinity Foundation bookstore, I'd encourage you to check out the full website. It's an amazing website. There's over 40 years worth of Trinity reviews. The Trinity Review, it's a publication the Trinity Foundation puts out several times a year, and their review articles, their scholarly articles, that are written on a lot of different topics, and it's really top-notch stuff. It's an embarrassment of riches, put it that way. And I would say there's nothing else. There's not another collection of Christian essays like that anywhere else. You won't find anything quite like that anywhere else. So I really encourage you to take some time. If you think you might be interested in John Rubin's work, there's a lot of additional work of his that's out there on the website, as well as Trinity reviews that are written by other authors as well. Also, too, if you like the work of the Trinity Foundation, if you appreciate this video, if you appreciate Ecclesiastical Megalomania, I really encourage you to think about making a donation to the Trinity Foundation. There's a secure, you can do that securely through Cornerstone. There's a link right there on the website that you can click, and you can make a one-time donation, or if you want, if you're so moved, you can make a recurring donation as well. So that's about all for the day. Again, thanks so much for joining me. I really do appreciate your attention through some of this, and I hope to see you again next time. The Bible alone is the Word of God.